Oh, it's happening now. So there I was surrounded, 42. Oh, we're having technical difficulties. There it is. Are we back? Hey, we're back. Even the cold open is awfully cold. Oh, it's so funny. Yeah, so we used a little bit of clickbait, surrounded by 42 FDA reviewers, but we were all drinking coffee together, so it was fine, right? Because when you meet the FDA before it's an audit, it's a good thing. You get to talk to them, you get to enjoy it. That's what happened at MedCon this year, where more than 10% of the attendees were from FDA, the rest from industry, including some of us from Into Beings. So we'll tell you all about that. We'll give you the local news and events, as well as talk about Illumina's second cybersecurity problem in the last year, which gets to a problem that we've seen many times that we'll talk about, not strictly from Illumina, but in terms of how you make these medical devices and the software involved in them. So we'll look forward to talking about all of that coming up next on MedTech Crossroads. All right, working all the bugs out. We are going to talk about the upcoming events. The first one is the A2 Biosocial. I'm sure some of you got to go to the A2 Biosocial in the D in Detroit on April 25th. The next one is coming right up back in Ann Arbor, Tuesday, May 2nd, 5 o'clock at Pretzel Bell. Matthew Himes, as always, leading that with support from Ann Arbor Spark, MishBio, and My Lead Consulting. So that will be Tuesday, May 2nd. Next up from the good folks at RAPS, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. If you've heard about risk management and you want to know more about it, one of the things you're going to hear from me today is how I think we need to get RAPS and the startup community more connected. This is an organization with about 3,000 members that has emerged from really the post-market world, the world of people selling medical devices that are already on the market. But the more education they do, the more these worlds come together. And so, for example, here is a session that I think I can recommend fully, covering 14971, the latest version of that standard. That if you're at all involved in the startup world, right, you're creating something, maybe you're an innovator, maybe you are a startup employee, maybe you're a mentor. Like, this is the kind of stuff you have to have a clue about. A friend just reached out the other day saying, how do I sit in on design reviews? How do I sit in on design reviews? I'm not an engineer, but I need to be able to sit in with these companies that I work with, and I need to have a clue of how to participate in that. So maybe you're never going to be doing this from scratch, but I think people are starting to recognize I need to be knowledgeable. Here's another example. You could go on May 4th. I guess it's an hour and a half program there. Not crazy long, but you could be part of that and learn a lot of the basics of 14971. More education coming up on May 9th from MishBio. The recurring event, second Tuesday of the month, the IP and Legal Expert Virtual Coffee Break. If you would like to get connected with a lawyer, that would be the place to go. And also from MishBio, the 2023 Michigan Life Sciences Showcase on May 15th in Lansing, Michigan. They're combining the Medical Device Summit, the Drug Discovery Symposium, Patient Advocacy Forum, Cannabis Science Symposium, and the Digital Health Forum, all on one day, May 14th in Lansing. And the good folks at AdvaMed are having a 510K workshop, an IDE workshop, a PMA workshop, all between the dates of May 15th and May 25th. So if you'd like to learn more about any of these, this would be a great event. For those of you engaged in university research, and I know that there are a lot of you doing that, the IDE submissions workshop. The more we work with universities, the more we realize that while investigators recognize that they might need some help with things like 510Ks and de novos, they often haven't really embraced the IDE process or what is involved in getting an investigational device exemption from FDA so that they can test their significant risk medical device on human subjects. A lot of times they'll think, well, if I just do research the way I've always done research, I will get results and FDA will be happy with them. Or they may not realize that getting that IDE can be just about as hard as getting an FDA clearance for a 510K or a de novo. So it's very important to understand. So I would recommend even that IDE submissions workshop to folks in universities if you're really committed to doing a clinical trial that's going to move you down the road and get you where you want to be. Coming up on May 23rd and May 24th, MGCS, the Midwest Growth Capital Symposium, is back. It's going to be held at Ross School of Business in Ann Arbor. Should be a great event. Scan the QR code if you're online to get connected to that. Got a chance when we were at MedCon to ask Jeff Shurin a quick question about hiring at FDA. We had reported this event last week, May 23rd through 25th, a virtual hiring event, scientific and professional jobs at FDA. Jeff and others remained very committed to hiring to keep up with the MDUFA 5 commitments. If you're not familiar with MDUFA, it's the Medical Device User Fee Act. They came up with the best acronyms there. Maybe not. Maybe we could use some PR on that. But MDUFA 5 has a bunch of commitments to hiring to make sure that there is review staff and others available at FDA. And so here's one of those tangible outcomes. If you'd like to work for FDA, you could have an opportunity. Go to the website linked here and see what kinds of jobs are available with the agency. Jeff had mentioned, and we'll talk about this later, that they really are trying. It's something that has become very challenging with the rise of remote work, right? You can get paid a lot more money sitting on your couch, depending on the kind of work that you do, than working for FDA. And of course, it's part of a big government bureaucracy, so those wages don't necessarily keep pace with the rest of industry that you find yourself working with. But for the right person, it could be a great stepping stone, so have a look at those. The Midwest Showcase, Innovation in the Midwest, Project Medtech, August. Stephen Rapundolo is going to be there. Tom Shehab's going to be there, as well as others. It's going to be held in Cleveland, Ohio, August 30th, 2023. Dwayne Mancini wanted us to mention that, and so we are letting you know. Put that on your calendar for August 30th. Those are the events. We're going to talk next about FDA and industry news. All right. Well, we've got one news item today. We're only doing one news item, if you can believe it. How did we only come up with one? There's not a ton happening in the news. I guess all of FDA was at MedCon, right? So that's why we've only got a little bit of FDA news today. But this one is interesting, and it's going to tie in to what we were talking about later in the show here. We're going to be talking about later in the show about cybersecurity. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity as well as artificial intelligence and machine learning as it was related at MedCon. Here, the company Illumina, for the second time in about a year, getting a cybersecurity warning from FDA over the sequencing software. Now, this, credit where credit is due, from the good folks at Medtech Dive. We're going to go to some FDA web pages from here, but want to acknowledge this article and this picture, their MI-Seq device here from Illumina, one of the subject devices of this concern. Here's what FDA says. The Illumina cybersecurity vulnerability. Now, it affects this thing that is called a universal copy service software. And that's about as interesting as it sounds. But it affects an awful lot of their sequencers here. And these are either clinical diagnostic units or they're research use only units. Okay? This brings up a topic that we have experienced countless times at Into Being, folks will come and they'll say, I'm going to make this software and I'm going to lock it down and it's going to be great, but I'm going to put an engineering mode into it. I'm going to make it so that the power user can do whatever they want. And while that makes perfect sense to most folks designing stuff, it gets you into trouble later on. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Because with all of this power behind the software that's not locked out, that if you know the right way in, you can change all sorts of things. It turns out that remote control of the device is possible. Altering settings, configurations, software, or data on the instrument or on a customer's network becomes possible. Actually impacting the genomic data results intended for clinical diagnosis, including causing the instruments to provide no results, incorrect results, altered results, or a potential data breach. So basically, there's a back door into this, but the reality is that this back door is actually a design feature. It's not a bug. We encounter that a lot, right? I mean, hey, it's not a bug, it's a design feature. In this case, it actually is, because they designed the same hardware and the same software to be for research use only, where you want that kind of access and you want that kind of control, as well as for clinical use, where you need to guarantee things like data integrity. So while they haven't received any reports of exploitation of this vulnerability, which is great, they have patched, Illumina has developed a software patch for this device, these devices, and it is up to the user. It's up to you. If your hospital or research institution is using this, it's up to you to download and install this on the instrument. Because I guarantee you, they probably didn't announce this until they had the patch ready, but now that they're announcing it, you got to imagine somebody sitting at their couch just saying, hey, can I get into one of these things? So this is worth knowing. This is the bottom line here. Some of the instruments have a dual boot mode that allows a user to operate them in either clinical diagnostic mode or research use only mode. And while the labeling should be different for those, it turns out that that mode is kind of available even for the clinical units, which is apparently what is creating this kind of an issue. Like I said, this is something we've seen before at Into Being, where folks want that power. They don't recognize how strongly they need to lock that power away from a clinical user to be able to guarantee the results that they are providing. This brings us to a topic which we're going to talk about as we talk about MedCon here in a second. Here's my impression. In the world of cybersecurity and in the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning, writ large, software, all these software areas, as some of our team have mentioned before in internal discussions, if you talk about mechanical engineering, if you talk about electronics engineering, if you talk about all sorts of ways that we interact with the world and create things, these disciplines have been around for decades, if not hundreds of years. When we sit down to make an engineering drawing, we are drawing on techniques and understandings that are more than 100 years old. When we sit down with software, we're drawing on very immature technologies, things that the world hasn't quite figured out how to fully work with. And so when people say, software is really important, AI is really important, ML is really important, cybersecurity is really important, I came back from the event basically saying to myself, well, we're able to acknowledge that, but this is still a very, very immature science. And that's what's getting the medical device world into little bits of trouble here and there. So I think it's something we need to address. It's something we've got to think about. And we'll be talking about that more as we talk about our main subject today, which is MedCon. So with that, on April 24th through 27th, I was down in Columbus, Ohio at the MedCon Conference. Beautiful Hyatt Regency hotel there. We'll leave that slide up for a while we talk. It was really an interesting event. Now, if you go back to 2019, MedCon before COVID was in full swing under the auspices of Xavier Health. Marla and others, the innovators of this conference, and just created a wonderful, wonderful event for many, many years. Enter COVID. Xavier Health is no more. This conference that was a partnership co-sponsored by the FDA, gone. And people started to reach out and say, wait, what are we going to do about this? We can't lose this conference. So, as it turns out, the organization RAPS that you've heard about from us, Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, as well as an organization called AFDO, got together. I believe it was actually Marla Phillips who found them. Even though she couldn't continue the conference under Xavier Health, she got quite a round of applause as the founder of this conference, I'll just have to say, at the plenary session. She was able to actually put together a continuation. So MedCon is now co-sponsored by FDA still, a lot of FDA buy-in to this, but also put on by RAPS and AFDO. And at the conference, there was about 300 attendees, of which, and this was our clickbait today, of which 42 were FDA staffers. That's like more than 10% of the attendees were from FDA. I don't even think we've fully made use of that, right? That is such an amazing thing to have FDA co-located with industry for 3 days. No one's doing any inspections. No one's breathing down each other's necks. We're all drinking coffee together and having events and talking about the kinds of issues that each wrestles with. It's a wonderful chance for cross-pollination. And in fact, before we get to the conference itself, the last conversation I had before leaving the conference on the last day was with Brian Savoy, who's the head of education for RAPS. Those of us who've been certified by RAPS have gone through education and testing that he's responsible for. And as I was talking to Brian, he indicated that, RAPS is an organization that has 3,000 members in it, but of course, this is mostly generated by industry, by existing industry, by, important word for today, post-market industry. It's for regulatory professionals to get together and talk about the business and to talk about it with FDA. It's a great thing. But RAPS is certainly interested in giving education to the startup world, something that we're passionate about. Then I started to think on the drive home, I realized this is the untapped potential of a conference like this. Why we even talk about it here today, where so many of our listeners are in the startup world, where they're pre-market, where they're doing things that are novel and risky. They don't have a lot of excess time on their hands. Well, here's where my thinking is going. This is a conference where if more than 10% of the attendees are from FDA, what better place for startups to learn quickly, to hear and ask questions and have coffee with and have a sidebar conversation with actual investigators from FDA, from actual division directors, from actual administrators. This is an untapped potential and something I want to talk about more as we go through this year and into next year, because I'd really like to see startup attendees coming to this conference, talking directly with FDA for 3 days. Can you imagine how much better our educational process as a community would be if we could make that happen? Let's have that discussion. And I got to say, the coffee's good. The coffee was never more than 100 feet away. And so that's what makes a good conference, I tell you that. Some things that were on the docket from the MedCon conference, obviously EPA ethylene oxide regulations, the emergence of the sterilization master file pilot program that we talked about on the show the other day. There's a lot of discussion about the recall process and how that process operates. Medical Device User Fee Act was definitely a highlight. trends in investigation, how FDA approaches their investigations, and cybersecurity risks. So we'll talk about these, and we'll talk about some of the other topics that were brought up. I will say, if you look at how conferences are done, this was very interesting. We got there and they wouldn't let us sit wherever we wanted. There were assigned tables, but not planned tables. It was completely random. Each folder had on the back of it, oh, look, this isn't the folder. This is the booklet that came. I'll just put that right there if anyone wants to see what we were looking at. The folders had table numbers on the back, and so you were forced to sit with people at your table who you had never met. Obviously, the FDA people couldn't sit together. You couldn't sit with people from your company. You had to go sit wherever they told you to sit, and it was completely messed up and mixed around. Now, the intention behind this, I think, was really, really good to get people talking to each other, not just listening to a presentation, but actually interacting. So, gotta give credit where credit is due for that part of the process. One of the early events was what they called a solutions exchange. Why are we sharing this, by the way? I think part of the reason we're sharing this is because we're very interested here at Into Being in how education happens, how networking happens, how communication between individuals happens in different silos. So many times we tell you something on the show, and we've had people come back and say, "Wow, thank you for telling me that. I wouldn't have known any other way." And the reality was the information wasn't that far away. It really wasn't that far away. It just took somebody bridging that gap. It took that happenstance conversation to get the information into your hands. And I think an organization like MedCon an event like MedCon is trying to do that. They're trying to put people together, get conversations happening that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So that's good. The first solutions exchange dealt with three things: design issues, cybersecurity issues, and then global market strategies. Here's where it fell down a little bit, though, was each table was tasked with thinking about one of these in a hypothetical situation. They had a hypothetical situation. We've got this person who's wearing a vest. It's an alarm vest, and if your heart starts going wrong, it will alarm. And they say, well, if this was your organization, how would you deal with the problem? How would you make changes through the design process? How would you make this situation better through looking at cybersecurity and digital health? How would you make this better by looking at strategic challenges? And so just sort of, work the problem with your table. You got 8 or 10 people here. Go ahead and work the problem with them so you can all learn how you might approach this. And the problem was that, for example, at our table, we were talking about cybersecurity, and nobody at the table was a truly qualified cybersecurity expert. And so there was a lot of hypothesis, but not a lot of learning or case study learning. That seems to be where the real value is. My colleague Adrian and I, Harris, were commenting afterwards that the case studies is where the real power of learning comes. When you can see something and you can say, how would I have solved that? Good. And then you get an answer that's specific to your situation. That's where the real learning comes from. And so we'll certainly be encouraging the MedCon conference to use more case studies and put the expert at the table with each group. But ultimately, mixing people up like this, I think, is something that startups need to be part of, as I said earlier, because you have a conference like that and you see a real issue with a real device out there in the market, and you force them to think, how would this affect me if I was in this situation? Oh my goodness, I never thought that I could be in this situation. Maybe I better go home and think about that. That's really the value of this kind of an approach. There was also such a meeting on table by table on supply chain issues. If you are involved in any kind of design and development, you know that the supply chain is still a complete disaster. And so another hypothetical situation was given where there was a shortage of critical components. You couldn't get custom batteries, single source of custom batteries. And the question was raised, what are some of the things you have to consider in planning your response to this? I know that our table came up with things like the quality management system impact. the design controls process, certifications that may be changing if you can't get it from the same supplier anymore. Can the firm actually supply batteries? If you find a new firm, who's to say that they can actually supply them? In fact, if the old firm that's letting you down can't supply the batteries, what makes you think that the new one that promises to can? What's the longevity of the firms involved? What's their regulatory history? What's the cost of the new batteries over the old batteries? What are their standards compliances? 60601, RoHS, etc. Where are they located? What will the impact of that location have on your accessibility? What impact will it have on things like imports and tariffs? What about shipping restrictions? There are shipping restrictions on batteries. Will that affect your experience in getting this new source for your batteries? Well, all good thoughts, but I think behind it all, two thoughts really emerged. One was, why do you believe that the new supplier will achieve something that the old supplier never was able to? This is a big problem with sourcing vendors. Oh, we need someone who can promise us the moon, but, well, maybe the problem that we're encountering has more to do with any particular vendor. You have to analyze that. We also heard from an FDA investigator at our table who mentioned that a lot of times companies will use what are called certificates of conformance to try to prove that they're meeting their requirements and they've got good components coming through the door. Well, as it turns out, these are often rubber stamped. They're often simply yeah, we send that form out with every shipment of components, and that tells the customer that they're getting what they asked for. But does it really? Or is it really just a rubber stamp? How does the role of testing as you bring parts through your door, or requiring further testing on the part of the supplier, how does that ensure quality coming through the door? So this is just another example of a good kind of deep dive as happened at this conference. I really do think that if startups were involved in something like this, they would learn a lot really, really quickly. Hey, I never considered that factor. I guess it's time for me to consider that now. Definitely drinking from a fire hose. Other topics on the docket were the medical device regulation delays, continued delays in Europe, and how that is slowing everything down. Talked with one colleague who mentioned how in her company, they had already gotten clearance by US FDA for their product, but because of the natural course of things, their product was receiving design changes. And so it meant that the European submission that they had made to the European Union needed to change, even though they hadn't heard back from Europe yet. So the product's changing on the US market, as products do. And the uncleared device in Europe, the submission itself that needs to be sitting there getting reviewed, was changing actively. So the fact that there's not this harmonization, there's the fact that you don't have the same process, and the fact that the medical device regulation in Europe is getting so delayed is just causing no end of problems. Harmonization and what they would say global convergence, a big, big, big topic. Going with that for just a minute, global convergence is going to be focused around 13485, the Medical Device Quality System International Standard. Now this, as you know, if you've listened to the show, is similar to 21 CFR 820, which is the U.S. design control standard. Good manufacturing practice standard, including the design control standard. Well, all of these types of things exist in 13485 in slightly different guise, and FDA is actually working hard to recognize 13485 to deprecate 21 CFR Part 820. So that is coming on the horizon. It really does now seem like that may happen eventually. We don't have a date for that, but global convergence onto 13485 is really, really coming down the road here. So this is the first time I think we've ever felt like it's actually coming, as opposed to just a pipe dream. We also talked about eSTAR and the FDA portal at the conference, nice walkthrough of those tools. It turns out that the days of walking a thumb drive and a hard copy to FedEx are coming quickly to a close. I believe the date is October, when now all of these submissions are going to go through eSTAR and the customer portal at FDA. So the customer portal has gotten good reviews and is definitely the way of the future. Before I tell you more about the conference, I want to go to one specific topic, and that is one that we love here on MedTech Crossroads, and that is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I have to say that the feeling that I walked away from as I listened to sessions on this is one of the emperor has no clothes. I guess you could say that I was becoming suspicious of that before the conference, but this really drove it home. We talk about these issues because they seem important, because we see a wave on the horizon. We don't know what to make of it, and we know we have to do something about it. So people are doing their best in good faith to do what they can. I think it's safe to say that in the world of cybersecurity and the world of AI/ML, we don't really know what's going on. Now, maybe that seems like a drastic statement, but when this unknown is coming down and you do the best that you can to try to address it, you're still waiting around to find out, what is this thing really? What are we dealing with? You know, if you look at it socially, we've got ChatGPT on one side doing these crazy things that we can't even fathom. It's amazing what it can come up with. But on the other side, we've got FDA validation, which is what is expected for clearance of a medical device. And that's not changing. And it never changed. And it's probably not going to change. So for all that we talk about and say, how are we going to adapt to artificial intelligence and machine learning? The reality is you still have to validate things. Of the, I think it's 500 artificial intelligence and machine learning clearances out there, most of them are for what are called locked algorithms. The algorithm itself is actually locked. It doesn't matter that it was developed using artificial intelligence and machine learning. All that matters is it got locked down at one point, frozen, and then validated. That means you could have created it anyway. You just happened to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to generate it. Now, that doesn't mean that all applications out there are like that. Some try to take data and use it, but we've learned from our friends in the industry and some out of the Weil Institute at the University of Michigan. I think that was the first place we heard that this data degrades. We heard that referenced explicitly at MedCon this year, that data does, it's not the data that degrades, it's the model degrades as it's fed new information that it wasn't trained on. And this may happen more slowly or more quickly, but it's a huge problem. Beyond that, the public seems to have this idea that extrapolation, and I'll talk about this more in a second, is going to become possible with artificial intelligence. We're going to be able to learn things that we never learned before and do things that we could never do before. And of course, all you have to do is look at some of the amazing AI generators out there to get an idea of the cool things that can be done. So what I did is I actually, a little project that I was doing for personal use, I brought some pictures with me today. So I've got them here on the iPad for you. I love writing music. It's a thing that I enjoy doing. And I was looking for content for a little album cover that I would like to have down the road. And so I used my favorite AI graphics generator. And I gave it a prompt. I said, "Tears from a stone." Well, I did get pictures of stones back. Here's a picture of a stone. Okay. I don't see a lot of tears there. Here's somebody crying over here, kind of in the shadows. And there's a stone over here. Okay. Well, this is amazing. This is actually freakishly amazing that it can do this, right? Here's another stone, bunch of stones. Here's a stone with a face on it, looking like it's crying. So right off the bat, I mean, incredible. I entered 4 words, and it came back with this. But here's a punchline. I didn't like any of these. One was kind of close, and so I took it and I started to work with it. You can see which one I liked a little bit better, and I said, "Hey, make me some versions of this." And I got this. I got a stone. Was that a heart floating inside of the quartz or something? I don't know. And some stones. Oh, and there's a sad face over there. Okay, interesting. Didn't really like any of those. Tried again. Got to some things. Oh, here's some droplets next to a stone. Now, on the one hand, it's completely amazing that it can do this from just a few inputs from me. But have you seen that I didn't like the first 3 things that it gave me? If we were talking about this in terms of validation, I would have to say that it failed the validation the first 3 times, because now it's requiring user input to tell it what the truth of the situation is. And the truth of the situation is that it hasn't met my need yet. It's come close, but I'm the one who still has to accept and reject whether what it did is good. So we kept going on. I kept working it. I'm not even showing you all the iterations that I went through before. Oh, this one had some shiny gems in it. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool, but it's not really what I was going for. And it's throwing all these ideas out for me. And then I was like, oh, well, that actually gets to another metaphor that I'd like to try. And I got these pictures out and I thought, no, that's not where I'm going either. So at this point, I'm working this through like 24 generations of ideas, constantly giving it input, rejecting what I don't like, and only accepting what I do, until I finally came out with what will probably be the final image, which I was quite taken with. And there's a lot of metaphors and meaning behind this in relation to the songs, which is cool. So if I just told you, hey, I'm using artificial intelligence and machine learning to make my album cover, and then I show you this picture, well, you're going to be pretty impressed. Like, Gene asked for an album cover, and it gave him that. My goodness, our medical devices are going to be so amazing in the coming years. But what I'm not telling you is how many generations I had to reject as being close but not good enough. Now take that to the medical device world. I represent the doctor in this story. The artificial intelligence art generator represents the AI/ML learning medical device. It wouldn't be acceptable for me to have to tell a device 24 times that it's wrong before I finally accept its answer. Wouldn't I, as a doctor, basically say, I'll just do it myself. That's what I studied for. I'll do that in one iteration, or at least I'll try the next thing in one iteration. This is the fundamental problem we have behind these artificial intelligence devices. In fact, I want to draw you a little picture that emerged, and when we talked through this during one of the conference sessions, I actually had a rather well-known risk consultant come up to me and say, that is the first time that anyone has made sense of this in a easy way. So I hope this is useful to you. If we have a relationship that we create between data, maybe represented by this, there's nothing particularly fancy about that. If I came up with that relationship, no matter how I came up with it, I still got to validate it. That is my responsibility, and that's what FDA is asking for. Prove to me that this line always represents the relationship between whatever your variables are. FDA is doing things that we talked about the other week, like the predetermined change control plan, to note that if you want to come in here and realize that the data is going to change in the middle, and you would like to ahead of time make a plan such that this data can change in different ways, and you have different ways of revalidating it, they're going to let you do that. They're going to let you sort of pull this section out of the middle, and they're going to say, yeah, you know what, if you know that this is about to happen, we will accept your plan for how you want to revalidate this section of your model. But there's nothing that's really rocket science about this. This is what you would have always had to have done anyways. This could have been done at any point in history with any device, that if you said, this is how we're going to deal with a change in this part of the product, this is how we'll validate it, you could have done that. On top of this, if this is a learning AI/ML model, what we're learning these days is that the entire model itself, the entire algorithm, is actually suspect. You have to monitor it to make sure that it's still true later on. This creates almost a deficiency. On top of that, people have this ill-founded belief that somewhere over here, the model is going to be able to predict the future in ways that we've never tested it to. But of course, validation can only be done truly on something that you've been able to look at ahead of time or a discrete subset of that data set. So we have a fundamental issue, and it's something that there weren't really, I have to say, any good answers to, and people sort of acknowledge this, that while we talk about what can we do about AI and ML, how can we realize its amazing potential, folks were not able to say that this fundamental issue has been dealt with. Interpolation versus extrapolation. FDA is doing cool things to allow better interpolation. Industry is doing cool things to be able to research how models degrade over time. But this fundamental question of we're never going to be able to extrapolate and validate at the same time, as illustrated by the graphical AI art example, it's always going to require somebody saying, was this good enough? Validation isn't going away. And so I do have to say, I walked away from this conference believing that this conversation really does need to continue. And at some point, we need to all say as a group, the emperor doesn't really have any clothes here. Extrapolation there isn't a philosophical way to address this yet. Or if there is, somebody's going to get a Nobel Prize for that one, because that's what this industry and the whole world looking at AI really needs at this point. So those are some good things from MedCon. I'm also going to tell you about one more thing, and it's basically the final session on the final day. They call it Investigator Insights. And again, I'm just harping on this point that I think startups would benefit from this conference. And this especially, what do investigators see when they investigate startup companies or post-market companies? What kinds of problems do they encounter? Of particular interest to our startup friends, we talk a lot at Into Being about justification and management oversight of a process. And there were some examples given of places where companies had supposedly done testing. They had never documented the failures. They only documented the successes. They didn't justify any of their changes. And management never approved of the changes. And yet they made the changes and they were running with them in production product. One of the speakers gave us this pithy quote, "If it's not written down, it's just a rumor." And of course, the whole idea with FDA is objective evidence. When FDA comes to audit you, they're looking for objective evidence, written evidence that something was decided and it was implemented and it was checked. And those were a lot of the types of complaints that we saw, that things were not written down, things were not according to how they were written down. There was one rather egregious example given where a company had fixed a pressure problem using zip ties, had done no root cause analysis, no risk analysis update, no reevaluation, and they didn't even retest the device at the maximum pressure. So if solving pressure problems with zip ties was not enough, they had not done anything to test this out. That was given as a negative example. So all of this to say, MedCon was interesting. There certainly could have been more use cases. We'll certainly give that as feedback to the conference. But even so, my big takeaway was here we are in the heartland of the Midwest. More than 10% of the attendees, FDA staffers, for 3 days on site. Our startup community needs to be present at this next year. This is going to become a goal for me, 2023. I want to see our startup community get out to MedCon next year, talk with FDA. Beautiful venue there, downtown Hyatt Regency. Great time. Lots of good food and good interactions. But let's make that our goal. I want to see the startup community come out in spades next year for this event. Well, with that, I think we're coming to the end of what we're going to be talking about here today on MedTech Crossroads. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. We'll always leave a moment for that. But we will look forward to seeing you all next week. Today is a rainy afternoon. We're giving an extra 15 minutes today. I wish there was some sun I could send you out to, but not to happen today. We got a hand from Ken. We can make Ken live, can't we? Let's see if we can make Ken live. Ken, do we have you?
Hi, Gene.
There he is.
Yes, hi, Gene.
Good to hear you.
Yeah. Listen, I wanted to thank you. What an outstanding discussion on the AI ML challenges that we're going to face, especially in medicine here. I mean, it was wonderful. And I hope we can use your examples in many places for the people that are working on this.
Yeah, Ken. Well, you are, I think, the first person to actually turn me on to this idea of the problems in AI when everyone was talking about, well, just how great it is and how much it's going to solve. And you guys at Weil were some of the first to really bring this to public attention. I do hope there's a way to get that kind of learning down to folks at FDA who are right now just trying to keep up with all the fog of war. So I appreciate that. You're welcome to use anything here, but I also hope we can get you connected to the agency to tell your story.
Good. Thank you, Gene.
Thanks, Ken. Great, wonderful comment. Well, we appreciate that. We are a quarter to the hour. I want to thank you for being here with us on MedTech Crossroads, whether you're watching on Zoom or whether you're watching on YouTube or after the fact on YouTube. We are just glad to have you here and happy to be talking about these important issues. We'll talk to you next week on MedTech Crossroads.